Alberta has a new government. Will the new energy policies actually change the fortunes of our hurting oil and gas sector? Today's guest may shed a little light on this. David Yager is an energy policy analyst and author of the book called From Miracle to Menace, Alberta, a Carbon Story. David, welcome back to BCN.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Now, the opening line in your book is, the current debate about climate change and what mankind should really do about it has deteriorated to the point of absurdity. Can you expand on that a little bit?
Well, if you're on one side or the other of the climate change debate, it all sort of makes sense. But if you're just looking and wondering what's going on, you should be completely confused. They're trying to ban tankers on the West Coast with Bill 48. And yet on the St. Lawrence Seaway, that's how Quebec gets all its oil imported, is by tanker. I would classify the St. Lawrence Seaway as more fragile or more as equally economically sensitive or environmentally sensitive as the West Coast. We've got John Horgan trying to block the pipeline, who's now having an investigation in the Lower Mainland about the skyrocketing cost of gasoline, even though the province and the feds have got a combined 52 cents a litre in taxes on it. So if you're looking at all this disparate information, and of course Alberta is struggling, we can't get oil or more fluids, hydrocarbon fluids to the Lower Mainland, of course, because the government is simultaneously complaining about the price while blocking the pipe. And so again, if this isn't perplexing, I don't know what is. It's just bonkers.
Now, David, Alberta has a new government with Jason Kenney, the UCP. They have a change in energy policies. Do you think this is really good news for the oil and gas industry?
I think it is, in the sense that there's a great deal of the challenges facing the oil and gas industry that are completely within the purview of the government of Alberta. And of course, he's suggested he's going to roll back the increase in provincial sales tax. If you recall, even though oil prices were falling, one of the first things the Notley administration did 4 years ago was increase corporate taxes. He's going to roll them back, which is helpful. There is myriads and myriads and piles of regulations in Edmonton that have been written up over the last 20 years. We flunked the red tape index in Alberta. And of course, the cost of government is something like 20% higher per capita in Alberta than BC, with no materially better health care services, no materially lower classroom sizes, and so on. So the idea that you could go to Edmonton and look under the hood after decades, really, of runaway oil spending and perhaps see if it's not possible to do more with less or do the same thing with less money, that's a refreshing review. He's promised faster drilling licenses. He's going to look into the regulator, the Alberta Energy, and AER, the Alberta Energy Regulator. So he has quite a number of opportunities to make things better with or without new pipelines. So I think there's generally there's enthusiasm for this change of government in the oil and gas industry, no doubt.
Now, do you think we'll actually see the go-ahead for the Trans Mountain pipeline expansion, despite the fact that Jason Kenney is planning to repeal the carbon tax?
I've been asked that question many times, and I can say when they're digging ditches, when the backhoes are moving dirt, and protesters are arrested, I can say conclusively the Trans Mountain pipeline is under construction, and they're determined to finish it. I don't know. It's just not intuitive in a government that's positioned itself on the climate file and as an environmental leader, that going into the election where they're not good. But put it this way, the Liberals are unlikely to win too many seats in Alberta. Saskatchewan is conservative now. Manitoba's conservative. Ontario's conservative. BC was a stronghold for Liberal seats in the last election. Perhaps the gasoline shortage, the gasoline prices and the fuel in the Lower Mainland is a reason you can improve this pipeline and not cost you votes. I wish I could be more optimistic. I haven't answered your question, but I'll be thrilled if they do it. I'll put it that way. I'll be thrilled if he does it, but it's just not intuitive to me going into a federal election that this is the sort of policy that the current Prime Minister really wants to campaign on.
David, people are looking at $1.75 a litre right now in the Lower Mainland of British Columbia. How high could it potentially go?
Well, you think they'd be happy about that. That's the purpose of carbon taxes. That's the purpose of the fossil fuel investment divestment movement. The whole concept of cutting off the supply of oil sands was to have the price go up, not down. You would think this was progress, that, for example, Andrew Weaver, the leader of the Green Party, he picked his words. He regretted the words he chose, but just recently he was saying, well, why don't you go get a personal line of credit and buy an electric car? Holy cow! So I would. How high could it go? Well, if Premier Kenney does what he's very, very unlikely to do, which is shut off the flow of the Trans Mountain Pipeline, I mean, the sky's the limit. But there's no question there is a shortage of product into that market. We've been trying to solve it for them for years and having to fight with them every step of the way.
What about Kenney's threat to implement Bill 12 that was actually put together by the NDP, the previous NDP government, and turn off the taps to British Columbia? How effective will this be in getting Premier John Horgan to say, hey, you know what, maybe we should have a pipeline go through BC?
Well, if they had an army, they'd probably send it in. Again, this is the big stick, and this is the tool that I think the Premier is unlikely to use. I believe they just had a commission into why gasoline prices are so high in the Lower Mainland. Just to give you an idea about the confusion that you referred to when we opened this chat. He's so why are prices so high? Well, as I said, there's 52 cents a liter in taxes alone. So if you could offset any supply shortages simply by rolling back taxes, the suggestion has been made now that the pipeline is owned by the federal government that it not be allowed to ship any dilbit or diluted bitumen at all, that it's carried nothing but gasoline and refined product. But of course, there is a small 50,000 barrel a day refinery in Burnaby that does require some oil. So it is, again, to the outsider looking in, this is pretty confusing. If you're trying to figure out what's going on, call me if you figure it out.
UCP leader Jason Kenney says he will cancel the NDP's almost $4 billion crude-by-rail lease contracts. Is that a good idea?
I'm a mixed on that one. The government of Alberta brought in the bitumen royalty in kind program back in 2007, and all the oil sands don't pay full royalties yet. So there's going to come a point, based on the current oil sands production, that the Crown could be receiving another 300,000 or 400,000 barrels a day in brick barrels, bitumen royalty in kind, which of course is their job to sell. And so I don't know the full details on this program. There's certainly mixed reviews in the industry. I'd sure hate to see those rail cars go. He may decide the government doesn't have to do it. I see there was a clip in the news today that CN Rail is happy to work with whoever. And so I do think that rail capacity will be required, unless there's a breakthrough on the pipe side that we don't know about. But remember that the Enbridge Line 3 expansion was supposed to carry oil later this year. It's been set back a full year. And so perhaps perhaps that cancel the rail was conceived when we thought we'd get that 370,000 barrels a day of pipe later this year with it set back a year. What's he going to do? I know you're going to find this hard to believe. He doesn't ask me. But I would say in the industry that most people think that keeping that capacity in one form or another is not a bad idea, since the commitments have been made. It's just whether or not the government has to own it. Perhaps there's a compromise somewhere in there.
Bill C-69 is awaiting all kinds of amendments. The Liberals would like to see it passed before the next federal election in October. Kenney calls it the No Pipelines Bill. Is this bill fixable, or is it inevitable that it would seriously hurt the oil and gas industry?
There's something like 100 different proposed amendments, and both the proponents of the bill and the opponents of the bill are proposing different batches of amendments. They're certainly going to try. It'll be interesting to see what flies, what comes forth on the amendment file, that if the Senate can agree on what amendments, and of course it'll be interesting to see what the government does about it before it shuts down for the summer sometime in June. Obviously, the good news about the hearings and everything about Bill C-69 is it has gotten enough further analysis by the Senate hearings across the country that it is unlikely to be passed into law in its current form. That I think we can all say, we can agree with some comfort. The question is, are they going to water it down as much as they have to? Because what they've really done is in looking at it, they've really put an incredible amount of power. You got these hearings, you got these regulators, you got this consultation. Ultimately, it goes back to the cabinet and the federal minister to say whether they like it or not. And that is really an element of uncertainty that investors, they just don't want that. They would like to know.
David, what about Bill C-48, the tanker bill? We chatted a bit about that earlier. Is there any hope of changing that?
It's pretty well got to go. It's got to die, really. It has to go away. I laughed. I saw a clip the other day that this was the energy minister in the province of Saskatchewan going on the hearings on Bill 48, and they said that we import oil in the St. Lawrence by tanker all the way down. We talked about that earlier. And this may be the only petroleum producing country in the history of the world that is banning the export of its domestic oil by tanker. It's right out there. And so Bill 48 is really unsalvageable. It's pretty well got to go in the garbage can again. Is that the sort of thing that we can see? I can see that one sort of dying on the order desk before Parliament shuts down prior to the election.
Now, what about Jason Kenney's claim that the Rockefellers and other political activists south of the border have landlocked Alberta's oil for decades? Any truth to that?
That's actually not Kenney's claim. He's picked up the work of West Coast researcher Vivian Krause, who has been exploring this subject for 10 years. But yeah, I found the same information when I did the book. And in 2008, there was a project out of the United States called the tar sands campaign, heavily funded by the Rockefeller family and others. Its specific purpose was to block pipelines, put money to support anyone opposed to the pipelines, and landlock Alberta oil, that to stop the development or growth of the oil sands for one of two reasons, either to save the world or to ensure that it only had one client, which was the United States. I'm not into the conspiracy theory side, but yes, there's no question that all the records indicate that these foundations have been putting money into the tar sands campaign for a decade. And I'd say if we tried to do that in Canada, if Canadians got caught interfering in U.S. politics at this level, I'm not sure they wouldn't send in the Marines and invade our country. And so, yeah, he's going to go down the path. And this is kind of interesting that a sovereign government is going to take on, even at the provincial level, is going to take on the environmental movement. That is a significant change from what's happened in the past.
So if Canada gets a new federal government this fall, Andrew Scheer becomes Prime Minister, how long would it take to rescind Bill C-69 and Bill C-48? And how long would it also take to regain investor confidence in our energy sector?
Well, again, it depends what shape C-69 is in at the time, whether it gets through the House or not. Again, my theory is Bill 48 isn't going to make it through the House, so you don't have to, or isn't going to make it through the Senate, so you don't have to rescind a bill if the new Parliament recalls it or asks the Senate not to approve it. Bill C-69 can be amended. You're going to have to convene the House, but the international investors are looking for a series of signals from Canada that we're going to return to being a reliable and predictable place to invest capital, because it's got a lot of it's got attracts, it's got the resource base, it's got the technology, it's got rule of law, laws we don't agree with, but you're not likely to be kidnapped if you work here. So it's got a number of advantages. So there's a bunch of boxes that need checking. One of them is the new Alberta government, so we checked that one. If we were to get a new federal government that clearly who had a purpose not to block the oil sands. I mean, Trudeau's on the record as doing this, blocking pipelines, blocking the oil sands. I mean, the whole program is pretty indicative that they're going to do what they can to hamper the growth of the fossil fuel industries in Canada. We're the only major oil producing country in the world. We're the fifth largest oil and gas producer in the world, by the way. We're the only one in the world that's self-immolating its economy. So a change in the federal government would be a significant signal to the international investment community that Canada has regained its senses and would like to get back into business. It would be fantastic.
David, one more question I want to ask you. I watched on a recent interview with Jason Kenney. He says we're okay with giving transfer payments to Quebec, BC, other provinces across the country, but we need to make money to be able to afford those transfer payments. So why wouldn't you think the feds would stand up and say, yeah, you know what? You're right, Alberta. We need some of those pipelines through Quebec and BC so you guys can get the money.
It goes back to the opening line of my book and the opening line of this interview, that the climate debate in Canada and the world has deteriorated to the point of absurdity. Yes, Alberta will take your money. This is Quebec. We'll take your money. We like the transfer payments. We like the oil tankers carrying oil down the St. Lawrence River, the one we dump raw sewage into from Montreal. And we do want your dirty oil coming through our pristine province. It is it is very, very difficult to comprehend. But that's modern politics. John Horgan, before he became premier in BC, was a Labour guy, and he was not opposed to the pipelines. He was just, this is his current tribe that got him into power. Doesn't like oil sands, doesn't like pipelines, so he's opposed. And I think Francois Legault is probably a pretty level-headed guy, but the people that voted him into office don't want pipe, and life's simpler if what could be more important than him maintaining his own popularity?
Sometimes common sense just isn't that common anymore. Energy policy analyst and author of the new book, From Miracle to Menace, Alberta, A Carbon Story. Thanks again for joining me on BCN.
Much appreciated. Thanks for your time. Have a great day.
You too. On behalf of all of us here at BCN, I'm Hal Roberts. God bless and have a great night.